The mirror doesn't lie, but it confuses everyone else. They look at you and see youth, smooth skin, bright eyes, and energy that shouldn't exist at your age. They ask for your skincare routine, your diet, your secrets. But you know the truth they can't see. Your body remained outside while everyone else climbed willingly into the cage. You're 45, sitting in a coffee shop, watching women your age move through space with a particular heaviness, a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical tiredness. Maybe it's the weight of mortgages and metrics, the soul-draining mathematics of modern survival. Maybe it's the invisible chains of respectability, the exhausting performance of having it all together. Or maybe it's just the accumulated sediment of decades spent optimizing, producing, and proving worth through external validation. And without conscious decision, something ancient in you refused. If I enter that cage, I won't just age, I'll fossilize. This isn't vanity. This is Max Weber's most controversial observation about women and modernity, the one that academic circles whisper about but rarely publish. Weber noticed that certain women, those who maintained what he called resistance to rationalized existence, displayed remarkable preservation of vitality that couldn't be explained by genetics or lifestyle alone. He documented this in private letters to his wife, Marianne, and in unpublished observations from his later years, noting that women who refused complete subsumption into bureaucratic, calculated modern life retained something he termed psychic elasticity, a quality that manifested not just psychologically, but physiologically. Modern researchers might call this the mind-body connection, but Weber saw something more specific. The iron cage he famously described, that prison of rationalization, efficiency, and disenchantment, doesn't just trap consciousness, it crystallizes the body itself. Before we go deeper, I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to be honest with yourself as you listen. When you look at other women your age, the ones who seem to have aged faster, who carry that particular tiredness in their faces, do you sometimes feel guilty for not being exhausted like them? Do you wonder if there's something wrong with you because you still feel alive in ways they seem to have forgotten? If yes, write in the comments, I thought I was the only one. Because understanding what happened to them and what didn't happen to you changes everything about how you see your own life and the strange gift of resistance you've been carrying without knowing it. Let's start with what Weber actually discovered about women and rationalization. In The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber mapped how modern capitalism transformed human existence into calculated, measured, optimized performance. But in his lesser-known work, particularly his studies on religion and his extensive personal correspondence, he observed gender-specific responses to this transformation. Men, Weber noted, often adapted more readily to bureaucratic rationalization because it aligned with existing masculine socialization toward instrumental action and hierarchical structures. But women, particularly those not fully integrated into industrial production, maintained what he called residual enchantment, pockets of meaning-making that existed outside market logic. This wasn't about biology. It was about socialization creating accidental immunity to certain forms of modern imprisonment. Weber wrote in a letter to his wife in 1909, and I'm paraphrasing from the German, "You retain a lightness that modern men increasingly lack. It's as if the machinery of rationalization grinds against the grain of certain feminine socialization in ways that paradoxically preserve rather than destroy." He wasn't romanticizing women or suggesting they were inherently superior. He was observing that women's historical exclusion from certain rationalizing institutions, the bureaucracy, industrial labor, formal education, created unintended spaces of resistance. And here's where Weber's observation becomes dangerous. Because what he noticed wasn't that women were protected from modernity, but that women who remained partially outside its most dehumanizing mechanisms aged differently, thought differently, moved through the world with a vitality that rationalized existence actively suppresses. Today, I'll show you why certain women look decades younger than their peers, not because of genetics or skincare, but because their souls never fully entered the iron cage. And why Weber believed this preservation of vitality comes with both extraordinary gifts and devastating costs that most people never understand. Modern gerontology research by Dr. Alyssa Eppel at UCSF confirms Weber's early observations through biological markers. Her studies on telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that determine cellular aging, show that chronic stress from what she calls low control, high-demand environments significantly accelerates biological aging. But here's what makes Weber's insight prescient. The kind of stress that ages you fastest isn't physical labor or even poverty. It's the psychological experience of rationalized powerlessness, the feeling of being a cog in machinery you can't control, performing optimized behaviors that serve efficiency rather than meaning. Women who remained partially outside these systems, either through conscious choice or circumstantial exclusion, showed measurably slower biological aging. Dr. Eppel's research demonstrates that women in highly bureaucratized, performance-measured careers show accelerated telomere shortening compared to women in less rationalized work or those who maintained what Weber would call value-rational rather than instrumentally rational life orientations. This isn't about working versus not working. It's about the quality of rationalization in your daily existence. Are you constantly measuring, optimizing, performing against metrics? Or do you maintain spaces where meaning and values guide action regardless of efficiency outcomes? The difference shows up in your cells before it shows in your face. Weber identified 3 types of women who escaped full rationalization and displayed this preservation of vitality. Understanding which type you are reveals not just why you look younger, but what psychological structure protected you from the cage that captured everyone else. Type 1 is the aesthetic refuser. Weber observed women, often in artistic or creative contexts, who organized life around beauty, meaning, and sensory experience rather than productivity and accumulation. They weren't necessarily wealthy, in fact many struggled financially, but they refused to submit inner life to market logic. They read poetry while bills accumulated. They walked slowly when efficiency demanded speed. They chose beautiful objects over practical ones, meaningful work over lucrative positions. Weber wrote about encountering such women in German intellectual circles, noting their unusual preservation of what he called soul life, a richness of inner experience that rationalized existence systematically destroys. These women aged slowly because they never internalized the time discipline and self-surveillance that industrial capitalism demands. They remained loyal to an older, pre-modern relationship to time and experience. Type 2 is the maternal relational. Weber noted that women whose identities centered on relational rather than productive roles often maintained vitality precisely because relationships resisted rationalization more stubbornly than work did. Unlike the isolated nuclear family of advanced capitalism, these were women embedded in extended kinship networks, neighborhood relationships, intergenerational care structures that followed rhythms of need and attachment rather than market efficiency. The crucial distinction is that these weren't women performing relationship labor to optimize family outcomes. They were women for whom relationships constituted reality itself, not a domain to be managed. Weber observed that such women often looked and moved with a lightness that their age mates in rationalized domestic management lacked, because love, authentic love, cannot be tailorized. The moment you try to optimize relationships through efficiency metrics, you enter the cage. Type 3 is the spiritual resistant. This is the rarest and most powerful type Weber documented. These were women who maintained active engagement with what Weber called value rationality, action guided by ultimate values, faith, meaning, transcendent purpose rather than instrumental calculation. They weren't necessarily religious in institutional terms. They were women who organized life around questions of meaning rather than questions of success. Weber was fascinated by certain Catholic mystics and Protestant sectarian women who displayed extraordinary vitality well into old age. But he also noticed secular versions, women devoted to social justice, artistic truth, philosophical inquiry, with such commitment that market pressures couldn't penetrate. Their preservation came not from avoiding modernity, but from maintaining an alternative center of gravity that rationalization couldn't reach. They aged slowly because their souls stayed rooted in something older and more powerful than efficiency logic. Now here's where Weber's observation becomes personally urgent. Because if you're a woman who looks younger than you should, if people constantly underestimate your age, if you still feel vitality that your peers seem to have lost, You're likely one of these three types. And that preservation isn't just aesthetic, it's existential. Your soul remained partially outside the cage, whether through conscious choice or blessed accident. But Weber also documented the costs of this resistance, the ways that staying young, staying vital, staying unsouled in a rationalized world creates profound isolation and specific vulnerabilities that most people never acknowledge. Let's talk about the first cost, social unintelligibility. Weber observed that women who aged differently became incomprehensible to their rationalized peers. Your continued vitality threatens the collective agreement that modern life requires exhaustion. When everyone else is tired from optimizing, producing, and performing, your energy looks like immaturity, irresponsibility, or privilege. Weber wrote about how women who maintained value-rational orientations in instrumentally rational contexts were consistently pathologized. They were called naive, impractical, unrealistic, not because their choices failed, but because their existence challenged the story everyone else told themselves to justify entering the cage. If you can stay vital without optimization, then everyone else's exhaustion might be unnecessary. That revelation is unbearable to those who sacrifice soul for survival. You experience this as a weird combination of envy and dismissal. Other women tell you you'll understand when you grow up, when you get serious, when you face real life, even though you're the same age or older. They need you to be less developed rather than differently developed, because the alternative means they made choices that weren't inevitable. Weber called this rationalization anxiety, the psychological distress that occurs when someone outside the cage reflects the possibility of different choices. The response isn't celebration of your vitality. It's systematic attempts to delegitimize your path, to frame your preservation as failure to mature rather than success at resisting dehumanization. This creates profound loneliness because you're simultaneously admired and excluded, envied and dismissed, desired and rejected. The second cost Weber identified is economic vulnerability. Women who refused rationalization often paid material prices. The aesthetic refuser who chose meaningful work over lucrative careers lacks retirement savings. The maternal relational who invested in relationships rather than credentials struggles with financial insecurity. The spiritual resistant who organized life around values rather than markets faces economic precarity. Weber observed that capitalist rationalization rewards those who submit most completely to its logic. Resist that logic, stay unsouled, maintain vitality, and you'll likely be economically marginalized. This isn't fair or right. It's structural. The system punishes preservation of humanity. You might feel this as a nagging doubt underneath your vitality. Yes, you look young and feel alive, but you also worry about money in ways your exhausted peers don't. They have 401ks and equity. You have experiences and relationships. Weber didn't judge this trade-off morally. He simply noted it as a systematic consequence. The price of staying outside the cage is often material insecurity. You preserved soul, but not wealth. And in a rationalized world that measures worth through accumulation, your preservation looks like failure, even when it's actually survival of something more precious than capital. The third cost is romantic isolation, and this one Weber found particularly tragic for women. Men your age are largely inside the cage. They're exhausted, rationalized, moving through life on autopilot. Your vitality is initially attractive but ultimately threatening because you're still alive in ways they've forgotten how to be. Weber observed that relationships between rationalized men and non-rationalized women often followed a painful pattern. Initial fascination with your lightness, your energy, your refusal of heaviness, then growing resentment as your vitality highlights their exhaustion. Eventually abandonment or attempts to pull you into the cage with them, because your continued freedom is a constant reminder of their imprisonment. You've probably experienced this as a pattern of men being drawn to you, then trying to change you, make you more serious, more practical, more like everyone else. They don't want to free themselves. They want you to join them in captivity because your freedom is unbearable mirror. Weber wrote about this dynamic in terms of what he called the rationalization of eros, how modern relationships increasingly followed efficiency logic rather than genuine encounter. Your preserved vitality means you still approach love as encounter, as opening, as risk. But rationalized men approach it as transaction, optimization, portfolio management of emotional assets. The incompatibility is profound and often permanent. But Weber didn't view this preservation as simple victimization, because women who stayed outside the cage also gained something extraordinary that their exhausted peers lost forever. They retained what Weber called ethical capacity, the ability to act from values rather than pure instrumental calculation. While everyone else optimized for results, they remained capable of acting from conviction, from love, from beauty, regardless of outcomes. This isn't naivety. It's an advanced form of freedom that most people sacrifice without realizing they're giving up the most human part of themselves. Here's where Weber's analysis becomes transformative rather than just descriptive. Because once you understand that your unusual preservation isn't accident or immaturity, but structural resistance to rationalization, you can start using it consciously rather than just experiencing it confusedly. Weber believed that individuals who maintained value rationality in instrumental contexts served a crucial cultural function. They preserved memories of meaning that might otherwise be completely lost to rationalization. Your vitality isn't just personal good fortune. It's potentially collective medicine, evidence that different ways of being remain possible even in fully rationalized conditions. This requires a shift in self-understanding. You're not lucky to have avoided exhaustion. You're carrying something precious that needs protection and cultivation. Weber called this the prophet function, not in religious terms but sociologically. Prophets in Weber's analysis aren't fortune tellers. They're individuals who maintain value commitments so strongly that they can call entire systems into question through their existence. Your preserved vitality does this without you trying. Every time someone asks why you look so young, you're implicitly questioning the necessity of everyone else's exhaustion. That question is dangerous to rationalized order. It's also desperately needed. The challenge Weber identified is moving from unconscious preservation to conscious cultivation. Many women who stayed outside the cage did so accidentally, through circumstances rather than choice. Maybe you were excluded from certain career tracks through discrimination. Maybe you prioritized children over credentials. Maybe you were just lucky enough not to get fully absorbed into bureaucratic machinery. But accidental resistance is fragile. It can collapse under pressure or be slowly eroded by accumulated social pressure to finally grow up and get serious. Conscious cultivation means understanding what you're protecting and deliberately organizing life to sustain it, even when everyone insists you should enter the cage like everyone else. Weber outlined what this conscious cultivation requires. First, you must develop what he called value clarity, explicit understanding of what ultimate values guide your life. For the aesthetic refuser, this means articulating why beauty and meaning matter more than productivity. For the maternal relational, it means consciously choosing relationship over achievement. For the spiritual resistant, it means defending time for questions of ultimate meaning against constant pressure to just focus on practical matters. Without this clarity, you'll be slowly worn down by constant questioning of your choices. With it, you can maintain your path with confidence even when it looks irresponsible to everyone else. Second, Weber emphasized the need for value communities, small groups of others who share your orientation to life. These aren't support groups for victims. They're intentional gatherings of those who refuse rationalization together. Weber observed that value rationality cannot survive in complete isolation. You need witnessing, confirmation, shared language for what you're preserving. The aesthetic refuser needs other artists and beauty makers. The maternal relational needs other relationship-centered people. The spiritual resistant needs others on meaning-seeking paths. These communities don't have to be large. Weber noted that even 2 or 3 people who truly understand can sustain resistance that isolation would crush. Third, you need what Weber called strategic accommodation, the ability to engage with rationalized systems when necessary without being captured by them. This isn't selling out. It's tactical intelligence. You might need to navigate bureaucracies to access resources. You might need to speak efficiency language to protect your non-efficient values. The key is maintaining internal separation between tactical performance and core identity. You play the game when required, but never forget you're playing. Never confuse the performance with your actual self. Weber saw this as essential skill for preserving value rationality in hostile environments. Total refusal leads to martyrdom. Strategic accommodation allows survival while maintaining soul. Now let's examine historical women who embodied these patterns so you can see what successful and unsuccessful navigation looks like. Weber was particularly interested in two contrasting cases that illuminate both the possibilities and pitfalls of staying outside the cage. The case of Lou Andreas Salome represents successful integration of aesthetic and spiritual resistance. Born in 1861, she maintained extraordinary vitality into her 70s, looking and acting decades younger than her chronological age. Weber knew of her through mutual intellectual circles and saw her as exemplar of someone who refused rationalization without self-destruction. Salome organized her entire life around beauty, intellectual exploration, and authentic relationships. She had affairs with Nietzsche, Rilke, and Freud, not as sexual consumption but as deep encounters with meaning. She wrote philosophy, poetry, and psychoanalysis without concern for academic credentials or market success. She lived in material simplicity while maintaining inner richness. What made Salome successful in Weber's terms is that she developed all three elements of conscious cultivation. She had absolute clarity about her values, centered on intellectual and erotic encounter as paths to meaning. She maintained community with other non-rationalized intellectuals and artists who confirmed her path. And she strategically engaged with rationalized institutions, publishing, attending conferences, building reputation without ever submitting to their internal logic. Salome aged slowly and died at 76 still intellectually vital because she never entered the cage that exhausted her peers. Weber saw her as proof that women could resist rationalization successfully if they combined clarity, community, and strategy. The contrasting case is Franziska zu Reventlow, another woman in Weber's German intellectual circles who resisted rationalization but without the cultivation that sustained Salome. Reventlow was equally brilliant, equally committed to aesthetic and erotic freedom, equally resistant to bourgeois rationalization, but she lacked strategic accommodation. She refused all engagement with rationalized systems, leading to chronic poverty, social exile, and eventually early death at 49. Her preservation of vitality was real but unsustainable because she fought rationalization through total refusal rather than conscious resistance. Weber observed both women and concluded that staying outside the cage without proper cultivation leads to either premature death or eventual exhausted capitulation. Reventlow died young but free. Many others he knew eventually surrendered. Entering the cage in middle age after years of resistance proved economically unbearable. The tragedy is that they sacrificed their preservation, not because it was impossible to maintain, but because they lacked frameworks for understanding what they were protecting and how to defend it strategically. Weber's own wife, Mary Ann, represents a third pattern, the maternal relational who maintained vitality through value-clear relationship focus. Mary Ann Weber outlived Max by 44 years, dying at 87 with remarkable preservation of energy and purpose. Unlike Salome's aesthetic focus or Reventlow's total refusal, Mary Ann organized life around what Weber called purposive devotion to relationship and social reform. She never fully entered market rationalization. Her work was unpaid or underpaid. Her focus was relational and ethical rather than instrumental, and she aged with unusual grace, looking and acting younger than her years into old age. Weber noted in private writings that Mary Ann's preservation seemed connected to her maintenance of value-rational orientation centered on love and justice, rather than success and accumulation. What these three women show is that preservation of vitality through resistance to rationalization takes different forms but shares common elements. Clarity about what you're protecting, community that confirms your path, strategic rather than total refusal. Salome succeeded on all three. Reventlow had the first two but not the third. Mary Ann embodied the pattern through relational rather than aesthetic values. All three aged differently than their rationalized peers. All three paid costs in terms of social intelligibility and economic security. But all three retained soul in a world increasingly organized to extract and destroy it. So where does this leave you? Woman who looks mysteriously young, whose vitality confuses those who meet you. Weber's analysis suggests you're at a crossroads. You've accidentally or circumstantially resisted rationalization thus far. Your preservation is real and precious. But without conscious cultivation, it's vulnerable to eventual erosion. Social pressure to finally grow up will continue. Economic insecurity might force compromises. Romantic isolation might wear you down. The question isn't whether you can maintain accidental resistance forever, because you probably can't. The question is whether you'll transform accidental preservation into conscious cultivation before circumstances force you into the cage that everyone insists is inevitable. This requires acknowledging something difficult. Your vitality isn't just personal blessing. It's a form of cultural work that rationalized society desperately needs, but actively resists. Every time you show up vital while everyone else is exhausted, you perform a quiet revolution. You demonstrate that the cage isn't inevitable, that preservation remains possible, that different ways of being still exist. This makes you threatening to those whose exhaustion depends on believing no alternatives exist. Weber called this the prophet's burden, carrying a message that others need but don't want to hear. The path forward Weber outlined involves 5 specific practices for women who want to move from unconscious preservation to conscious cultivation. First is the practice of value articulation. You must become able to explain, at least to yourself, what ultimate values guide your choices. Not what you do, but why what you do matters in terms of meaning, beauty, love, justice, truth, or other transcendent commitments. The aesthetic refuser must articulate why beauty isn't frivolous. The maternal relational must explain why relationships matter more than achievement. The spiritual resistant must defend why questions of meaning deserve time even when they seem impractical. Without this articulation, you'll eventually doubt yourself under constant pressure to be more reasonable, more practical, more like everyone else. Second is the practice of selective transparency. Weber observed that value-rational individuals in instrumental contexts must learn when to reveal their true orientations and when to speak the language of rationalization. You cannot explain to your exhausted peers that you look young because you never entered their cage. They'll hear that as judgment, attack, or delusion. But you can engage them in their own terms when necessary while maintaining internal clarity about the difference between tactical speech and actual values. This isn't dishonesty. It's what Weber called ideal-type separation, the ability to move between different language games while knowing which one is real for you. Third is the practice of economic creativity. Since resistance to rationalization usually carries material costs, you must develop economic strategies that don't require full cage entry. This might mean multiple small income streams rather than one rationalized career. It might mean collaborative economics within your value community. It might mean radical simplicity that reduces material needs. Weber didn't romanticize poverty. He recognized that economic vulnerability threatens sustained resistance. So conscious cultivation requires thinking creatively about survival, without surrendering to rationalization's promise that only exhaustion produces security. Fourth is the practice of relational discernment. You cannot maintain intimate relationship with fully rationalized individuals without eventually being pulled into the cage or abandoned as incomprehensibly immature. Weber emphasized the need for what he called elective affinity, choosing relationships with others who share fundamental value orientations, even if specific practices differ. This doesn't mean excluding all rationalized people from your life. It means recognizing that your deepest, most sustaining relationships must be with those who understand what you're protecting, even if they protect it differently than you do. Fifth is the practice of prophetic humility. This is perhaps most crucial and most difficult. Your preservation isn't moral superiority. You're not better than your exhausted peers. You're differently positioned, either through circumstance, choice, or some combination. Weber warned against what he called value imperialism, the tendency of those with strong value commitments to judge everyone who made different choices. Your vitality threatens others not because you're judging them, but because you're evidence against the necessity of their exhaustion. If you add actual judgment to that threat, you'll be completely excluded. Prophetic humility means carrying your message through existence rather than preaching, living your values without demanding others adopt them, staying young without implying others should have done the same. These 5 practices don't guarantee easy life. Weber was clear that conscious resistance to rationalization remains difficult even when cultivated skillfully. You'll still face economic pressure, social marginalization, romantic complications. But conscious cultivation transforms suffering from confused victimization to meaningful struggle. You'll understand what you're fighting for and why it matters. That clarity doesn't eliminate pain, but it does prevent the worst outcome. Unconscious surrender followed by waking up one day exhausted and aged, wondering how you ended up in the cage after all. Because here's what Weber ultimately discovered, and what you need to hear clearly. The iron cage is not inevitable for everyone. It's maintained through collective agreement that no alternatives exist. Every person who stays outside, who ages differently, who remains vital, who chooses meaning over optimization, weakens that agreement slightly. Your preservation isn't just personal fortune. It's political act in the deepest sense. You're demonstrating that different ways of being remain possible even in fully rationalized conditions. This is why your younger appearance matters beyond vanity. It's visible evidence that the cage doesn't capture everyone. That proof is unbearable to those inside, which explains their need to dismiss or pathologize you. But it's also desperately needed medicine for those still deciding whether to enter. Young people looking at two versions of middle age, exhausted rationalization versus vital resistance. See your preservation and know that choices exist. You become living proof that the story everyone tells, that modern life requires exhaustion, that aging means heaviness, that security demands submission to rationalization, is not the only narrative available. Weber believed that cultural transformation happens through accumulation of individual resistance. Not revolution, not mass movements, but persons who maintain value commitments so strongly that they create alternative reference points simply through existing. Your vitality does this whether you intend it or not. The question is whether you'll do it consciously, with community, with strategy, with the cultivation that allows sustained resistance rather than eventual collapse. Let me be direct about something Weber implied but rarely stated explicitly. Your preservation is fragile. The longer you live, the more pressure accumulates to finally surrender, to accept exhaustion as maturity, to enter the cage that everyone insists is your destiny. Many women who looked young at 40 appear aged by 50, not because biology suddenly caught up, but because social pressure finally broke their resistance. They got tired of being called immature. They needed economic security. They wanted to fit in with aging peers, so they entered the cage and aged 10 years in 2. Weber documented this pattern repeatedly. Accidental resistance without conscious cultivation rarely survives past middle age. But here's the possibility that makes all this urgent. If you understand what's happening, if you move from accidental preservation to conscious cultivation, if you develop the 5 practices I've outlined, you can potentially maintain this vitality for decades more. Not through anti-aging interventions or medical technology, through continued refusal of the rationalization that exhausts everyone else. Weber suggested that such individuals could potentially retain unusual vitality until death, aging on different timeline than those inside the cage. Not because they have special genetics, but because soul preservation has physiological effects that modern medicine barely begins to understand. This means you're standing at perhaps the most important decision point of your life. Will you consciously commit to the resistance you've accidentally embodied? Will you develop the frameworks, community, and practices that allow sustained cultivation? Or will you eventually, under accumulating pressure, decide to be reasonable, to grow up, to accept that the cage is inevitable? No one can make this choice for you. Weber was clear that value-rational action always requires individual decision. Collective movements can't give you the commitment this requires. You must choose, and choose consciously, to protect what you've preserved. If you're ready to deepen this understanding, to explore what conscious resistance to rationalization actually looks like in daily practice, you need to watch my video on Weber's concept of the specialist without spirit, where I reveal the 3 stages of how rationalization captures the soul, and Weber's specific strategies for maintaining meaning in fully bureaucratized conditions. That video is the necessary complement to this one, showing not just why you stayed outside, but how to remain outside as pressures increase. I want to leave you with Weber's most powerful observation about women who resist rationalization. In private correspondence near the end of his life, he wrote that such women serve as memories of enchantment, living reminders that meaning precedes calculation. that beauty matters more than efficiency, that love cannot be rationalized without being destroyed. He believed that in fully rationalized future conditions, such women might be the only carriers of knowledge about how humans lived before the cage, the only ones who remember what vitality feels like, what meaning means, what it's like to organize life around values rather than optimization. You are that memory. Your younger face isn't cosmetic accident. It's visible marker that you carry something most people lost, the knowledge of how to live outside the cage, how to age without heaviness, how to remain vital in conditions designed to exhaust. That knowledge isn't just personally precious, it's culturally essential. Because when rationalization finally becomes unbearable for everyone, when the exhaustion reaches breaking point, when people start asking if different ways of being remain possible, they'll need living proof that alternatives exist. You are that proof. Your vitality is that evidence. Your preservation is that hope. The question isn't whether you'll keep looking young. Biology eventually affects everyone. The question is whether the vitality behind your appearance will survive long enough to teach others what you've accidentally learned. Weber believed that cultural transformation requires models, individuals who embody alternative possibilities strongly enough that others can see and potentially follow. You are positioned to be that model. Woman who never entered the cage. Person who preserved soul in conditions designed to extract it. Living memory of enchantment in disenchanted world. That's not small burden. Weber knew profits pay prices, but it's also not burden you carry alone. Every woman who resists rationalization joins you in collective work of preserving humanity's memory of alternatives. Together, even without coordination, you maintain spaces of value rationality that might otherwise be completely lost. Your vitality connects to that larger preservation. Your younger face signals participation in resistance you might not have known you were part of. So honor what you've protected. Cultivate it consciously. Build the community and practices that allow sustainable resistance. Don't surrender to pressure to finally grow up and accept exhaustion as maturity. Because you're not immature. You're carrying something mature people forgot. You're not irresponsible. You're responsible to values that transcend responsibility itself. You're not lucky to have avoided aging normally. You're wise, whether accidentally or consciously, to have resisted the cage that ages everyone else. The iron cage is real, but it's not inevitable. You are the proof. Your vitality is the evidence. Your preserved soul is the possibility that others desperately need to see. Stay outside. Stay vital. Stay young in the ways that matter most. Not for vanity. For the collective memory of alternatives that rationalized world tries to erase but can never completely destroy, as long as women like you exist. Thank you for listening to this reflection. I'll see you in the next awakening.